2019. The fact-finding mission lasted for 2 years and resulted in reports both in 2018 and 2019. It was an investigation. We had staff and we ourselves, the 3 expert members of the fact-finding mission, conducted interviews with witnesses and victims of human rights violations, people who could provide what is called primary evidence, that is, what they saw themselves and what they experienced themselves. During the course of our work, we interviewed around 1,250 primary witnesses and victims. In addition, we collected secondary evidence from those who could talk about what had happened in an analytical way. So from non-government organisations and other civil society organisations, academic experts, people in UN agencies, people from academic think tanks, and analysts. They were in addition to the 1,250 direct victims and witnesses that we spoke with. And the fact-finding mission prepared a series of reports. In all, we presented 6 reports to the Human Rights Council, 2 in 2018 and 4 in 2019. One of those reports is the subject of our discussions today, and that is the report on the business interests of the Tatmadaw. We were concerned from the work that we undertook that the Tatmadaw was operating completely outside the monitoring, surveillance and instruction of the civilian government. That meant not only that the ministries responsible for the military were under military control, but also that the fundamental control that any democratic system has over the military, budgetary control, lay outside the scope of parliamentary oversight. The military took a very large part of the state budget of Myanmar, something like 13% in 2018. But in addition to that large part of the civilian budget, the military's business operations enabled it to operate independently of civilian budgetary control because it itself had access to so much money. A large part of the Myanmar economy between 1960 and 2010 was controlled directly by the military. By the late 20-teens, so 2018, 2019, the Myanmar economy was much more diversified than it had been previously, but still a large part of the economy was under military control. For that reason, we focused in 2019 very much on the business interests of the military and sought for the first time to document them as comprehensively as possible. We can't say that we had a total picture because so much of the military's operations are secretive, are hidden in one way or another. We think that we only started the presentation of the global picture. And at the end of our work, we said that much more work needed to be done by many other independent mechanisms than we were able to complete. Nonetheless, our report in September 2019 was probably the most comprehensive examination of military business that existed at that stage. More work has been done since then. We identified a number of principal areas of business activity and the vehicles by which the Tatmadaw operated that activity. Firstly, we pointed to the 2 major holding companies, Myanmar Economic Corporation and Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited. These were the major vehicles by which the military's businesses were conducted. And we were able to identify more than 100, I think 120 or 130 subsidiaries of these 2 holding companies as the ways in which the military had its finger in so much of the business activity taking place in Myanmar. In addition to those two conglomerates and their subsidiaries, we identified a number of other individual businesses which were directly owned and operated by the military in one form or another. And we also identified crony businesses. That is, businesses that may not have been under direct military control, but were under strong indirect military influence because of the closeness of the businessmen to the generals and various military units within the military. The military operated these businesses through a number of different types of business model. First, there were partnerships and joint ventures. This involved the military going into a business relationship with other corporations, both domestic and international, and the military taking its share of the profits. One example of that is the joint venture with the Japanese brewer Kirin. That joint venture had two local companies, Myanmar Brewery and Mandalay Brewery. Kirin owned 51% of these businesses, and Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited, one of the military conglomerates, owned the remaining 49%. And the profits for these businesses were then split in those proportions, 51-49, between Kirin and Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited. These joint ventures and other forms of partnership set out the proportion of ownership between the military and the non-military sides, and that determined the division of profits. Secondly, we identified areas where the military was operating by way of a landlord, and so renting properties to domestic or international businesses and claiming the rent. Most of these rental arrangements gave rise to a number of different issues. First and foremost was the question of how the military acquired this property in the first place. It was not the case that the military had long-standing ownership of the property or had bought the property for value from the original owners. Rather, in most cases, the way in which the military acquired the property was itself extremely suspect. It either forcibly acquired the property from the original owners or simply made a claim to the property, overriding the interests of the original owners, or alternatively got the property by paying some form of minimal compensation to the original owners. Having then acquired the property, the military leased it at a profit to a local or foreign business that took on responsibility for development of the property. The development agreements would generally involve the foreign or domestic partner developing the property, for example, a port with Adani, or a shopping centre, or a hotel with Hilton, for example. The private corporation paying rent for a period of years, and then at the end of the rental period, the development itself going into military ownership. Generally, these leases were 50-year leases, but they held out the promise that the military would acquire a very valuable asset without further payment at the end of the rental period. The third form of business was a licensing agreement, where the military would license some other company to exploit a natural resource. This kind of arrangement was particularly prevalent in the gem industry, in the timber industry, and also some forms of arrangement in relation to oil and gas. In all of these arrangements, whether joint venture, rental, or licensing, the military stood to make very significant income without any investment of its own. These were classic vehicles for corruption, and for what is called rent seeking or rent making, because there was no real commitment from the military of dollars or chat. Simply providing nothing, the military stands to reap significant income as a result of the investment of significant sums by foreign or local private businesses. In examining military businesses in this way, the fact-finding mission recommended complete economic disengagement with the Myanmar military. We were operating under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for businesses. And Tui Tui will be talking about this after I've finished this part of the session. And we indicated, firstly, that the military needed to get out of business in Myanmar. We found these whole operations unacceptable. The business of the economy is not the business and should not be the business of the military. In any state that is properly run, the military is not an economic actor, but an arm of the state subject to the control and oversight of the civilian government and subject to complete budgetary control by the elected parliament. Interests in business like this enable militaries to operate outside this kind of civilian oversight, including parliamentary budgetary oversight. And so, in a word, in a sentence, the business of the military is not business. It's national defense. And the economy of Myanmar needs to be demilitarized if Myanmar is to develop as a democratic state. Disengagement from military business is one way in which this could be achieved. And so we made very strong recommendations, not for comprehensive economic sanctions on Myanmar as a nation, but for targeted sanctions that place pressure on the military and encourage private business to get out of bed from the military. This, however, is hard. And we are seeing this year how difficult this can be. I can point to two examples of the difficulty. The Japanese brewer Kirin, that I have already referred to, announced shortly after the coup began on February 1 that he would end its joint venture partnership with the military in Myanmar Brewing and Mandalay Brewing. And since then, since February, Kirin has been trying to end that joint venture on a satisfactory basis. Kirin decided and announced that it wanted to continue its investment in Myanmar. It was not prepared to walk away from Myanmar, although it was very anxious to walk away from the joint venture with the military. How to do that has proved to be the problem. Kirin has sought to end the joint venture by entering into negotiations with the military conglomerate, MEHL, for a different local company to buy out the military's interest. But MEHL refused to enter into negotiations. After 9 months of frustration, Kirin announced in November that it would commence legal action against MEHL to end that partnership. Under the joint venture agreement, that legal action could be taken in Singapore under Singapore law, but immediately MEHL sought to preempt that action in Singapore by saying that it would go to the courts in Myanmar to dissolve the joint venture on the basis that it was bankrupt. Now, action in the Myanmar courts will lead to a quite predictable result. That is, the military will get whatever it wants. And the concern now is that the military will simply take over Kirin's interests in the brewing companies without any payment to Kirin or any replacement of Kirin, or rather any replacement of the military, by a local company. Kirin conceivably could sell its share to the military, but that gives the military a very valuable asset. Kirin could purchase the military's share, but that will involve Kirin paying hundreds of millions of dollars to the military for its 50% or 49% stake. It's a very difficult kind of situation that Kirin finds itself in. And there's no good way out that I can see. But the very worst way out, the worst option, is that which the military is now seeking. And that is simply to take over Kirin's share of the business without any compensation to Kirin, and essentially acquiring for free a very valuable asset. An alternative approach is shown by the Norwegian company Telenor. And this too shows the difficulty. Telenor also, a telecommunications company, Telenor also decided that it wanted to get out of its partnership with the military. Its approach, however, was to get out of Myanmar as a whole. And it found a willing purchaser, a company called M1. Now, M1 itself is a suspect company. It's part of the business empire of the new Prime Minister of Lebanon, and has been subjected to scrutiny in a number of different countries for improper practices. Within Myanmar itself, M1 is directly in bed with the military now through the military half-owned telecommunications company Mytel. And so Telecom selling out to M1 was by no means a desirable result. Sure, it would have got Telenor out of Myanmar, but it would have resulted in enhanced military control of the telecommunications sector, and I don't think anyone wants that. So the experiences of Kirin and Telenor reflect the complexity of any decision to disengage economically from the military. I don't think there are easy answers. We certainly want to reduce the economic control of the military. In the medium to long term, we want to see military assets simply stripped from the military and placed under civilian ownership of a civilian government in Myanmar, a democratically elected civilian government. If there is to be governmental involvement or state involvement in the military economy, it needs to be under civilian ownership, civilian control of the civilian government. But under the current circumstances, of course, that's quite impossible. So moving from the current situation of military engagement in the economy to one in which the economy of Myanmar is demilitarized is a very difficult task. It's very much linked to the current struggle between the democratic movement in Myanmar and the Myanmar military. And perhaps it will only be ultimately resolved when the military is put back in the box, put back in the barracks where they belong, and a proper democratically elected civilian government assumes comprehensive control of governance of Myanmar. In the meantime, there are many complex issues that need to be addressed. So that's enough from me. That's all I want to say. And it's probably already too long. But I would welcome your comments, particularly any insights you've got, any suggestions you've got as to how we can demilitarize Myanmar's economy. But over to you.